For 13 years, some of the most horrific murders Milwaukee has ever known were happening right here under their very noses, being committed by a man who authorities never suspected due to his calm and quiet nature. Little did authorities know that this man would leave a stain on Milwaukee that remains to this very day. For over 30 years after his death, people still know the story of one of history's most infamous serial killers, the Monster of Milwaukee, Jeffrey Dahmer. Welcome to Gwen the Ghost Guide. I am Gwen, your guide for all things ghostly here in Milwaukee. Today on Gwen the Ghost Guide, we'll be talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. In a hot summer night on July 1991, police discovered the evidence of Jeffrey Dahmer's grisly crimes. 7 skulls and 4 human heads were recovered from Dahmer's apartment. But before we start talking about the details of the case, let's remember that Jeffrey Dahmer was at one time a kid. He was born on May 21st, 1960, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As a child, Jeffrey Dahmer grew up in Bath Township, Ohio, where his family moved in 1968. While a child, Dahmer collected dead animals that he found and experimented on how to preserve them. He would later use these techniques in preserving the remains of his victims. It is important to note that Dahmer did not abuse animals like many serial killers do. He would go with his father and collect roadkill, and these are the animals that he would preserve. According to people who knew Dahmer in childhood, it is alleged that Dahmer liked to listen to their heartbeats and was very interested in human and animal anatomy. Dahmer was known to show up to school under the influence of alcohol. He was also a bit of a prankster, often showing up in yearbook photos under clubs he was not a part of. There's even an infamous photo of Jeffrey Dahmer in a yearbook where his face has been blacked out because he essentially photobombed. In 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer's parents went through a bitter divorce. His mother abandoned him that same summer. Jeffrey was 18 years old at this time. On June 17, 1978, Dahmer would commit his first murder at the age of 18 in his Ohio home. In January 1979, Jeffrey Dahmer joined the Army. He was sent to West Germany as a combat medic in July. He served in the Army for 2 years before being discharged in March 1981 for his alcohol abuse. Dahmer moved in with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin in 1982. In the summer of 1988, Jeffrey Dahmer was ejected from the Milwaukee gay bathhouses after it was discovered that he was drugging other men. One of these victims was even hospitalized for 10 days, though no charges were filed. In November 1987, Jeffrey Dahmer committed another murder, his first in Wisconsin and second overall, at the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee. He would later take these remains to his grandmother's house where he disposed of them. He would go on to kill 2 more people the following year. In January 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer pled guilty to second-degree sexual assault and enticing a minor for immoral purposes. He was sentenced to probation and 10 months in jail. In March of 1989, before he was sentenced to his 10-month jail sentence, Jeffrey Dahmer committed another murder at his grandmother's apartment. In June 1990, after serving his 10 months in jail, and while still on probation, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder in his Oxford apartment, where he would continue to take the lives of many more victims. He later committed murders on July of 1990. Also in July, he attacked a 15-year-old boy, but that child was able to escape. In September of 1990, there were 2 more murders. February 1991, April 1991, 2 in May of 1991. One of those victims in May of 1991 was a 14-year-old who was given back to Dahmer because the police believed it was a lover's quarrel. Dahmer was able to convince them that the victim was 19. The victim happened to be related to the victim of the 1989 case in which Dahmer was on probation for. June 1991, there were 3 murders in July of 1991. And on July 22nd of 1991 is when Dahmer met the victim who escaped and was able to expose him. This victim was seen by police running down the road with a handcuff attached to his wrist. When the police investigated, the victim led them back to Jeffrey Dahmer's apartment, where they found Polaroids of dismembered bodies and the remains of his victims. He was arrested and taken into custody that night. On February 14th, 1992, Dahmer was found sane for 15 counts of murder. He pled guilty, but was trying to get off by saying that he was insane when he killed the victims, so that he would go to a mental institution instead of prison. But like I said, he was found completely sane and was sentenced to 957 years in prison. He was murdered by another inmate on November 28, 1994, after only serving about 2 years in prison. Joining me on the show today is a very special guest, award-winning author and former journalist Annie Schwartz, author of the book Monster, the True Story of the Jeffrey Dahmer Murders. Annie was the first reporter on the scene of Dahmer's apartment in 1991 and covered the entire Jeffrey Dahmer case for the Milwaukee Journal newspaper and later with ABC. Welcome to the show, Annie.
Thank you so much for having me, Gwen. I appreciate it.
So
You were telling me
excited.
when we first started talking, you said you weren't a good Milwaukeean or a Wisconsinite, was it?
Well, I'm not born here. I'm from the South.
So when you said I'm not a good, Wisconsinite or a good Milwaukeean because I don't mind talking about the case, that's truer than you know, because a lot of people don't want to talk about the case here anymore. Everywhere else, they do. And that's obvious by what we've seen with the Netflix adaptation and all of the other...
So many inaccurate things in that Netflix thing.
Yeah, don't get me started. Or is that why I'm here, to get me started?
We're not going to talk about that because I watched it when it first came out, realized it wasn't good, and I stopped watching midway through the series. So I was like, you have the facts wrong. You are trying to make him a tragic hero, and Jeffrey Dahmer is not a tragic hero. He is a monster. That's just point blank. That's what he is.
No, you're right. You're correct about that.
Let's not romanticize monsters.
Telling their story in a factual way, I would not have objected to, because I have taken part in a number of documentaries that have done that. A number of documentaries that have featured the case and have asked me to come on and talk about my experiences covering the story. But, what happened in the case of Netflix was they are deciding, and Ryan Murphy, the producer, is deciding to make movies. And that's okay, because he never says, I'm making a documentary. The hard part for me is people who have never really heard of the case or haven't read up on the case, maybe they're younger, they go to this movie to watch it because they want to see what happened during the Dahmer case, and they're not getting the correct information.
Yeah, half the facts are made up.
And it's just wildly inaccurate. So I can't punish him for making a movie because he never said, I'm making a documentary. It's clear that when he did my story, along with another friend, Robert Rand, who is following the Menendez case since the early days, both of us had material from our books used, but it's very hard. You can't really have a fight about intellectual property when you cover something that is in the public domain, right?
Yep. And as respect, since we are covering, the murders of, Jeffrey Dahmer, as respect for the families, I've made the decision not to talk about the victims by name.
Okay.
So, if just while we talk,
Mm-hmm.
just, because I do know the families don't tend to like when people bring up the names, from what I've heard from
Mm-hmm.
other podcasters who have covered the facts of Jeffrey Dahmer. I even know that they tried to sue the Netflix.
They did. They did because they are saying that they were not contacted. Yeah. And again, Ryan Murphy comes back and says, I don't have to contact. Well, they claim that they reached out to the families. I don't have any way of proving or disproving that. But the families have felt, as many families do in very high-profile crimes, they feel everyone else is, capitalizing on their loved one's death. And it's hard to... It's hard to have those conversations. I've had those conversations with the families, but it is, this has been 34 years now, and it's still as raw as if it was yesterday.
Yeah, and I don't blame them, because what happened to the victims is you wouldn't want that on your worst enemy, let alone somebody you actually loved and cared about. So yeah, out of respect for the families, we're just not going to say the victims' names.
That's fine.
So going back to that night, what was your initial thoughts when you got that phone call in the middle of the night? It's like 11:30, the phone rings, and somebody's like, you need to get down here, there's a head in the fridge.
Essentially, that was the phone call. And I was a crime reporter. I covered crime in Milwaukee starting in 1987. And this was 1991. So I had been out and about at crime scenes. I had gotten to know the cops. I had gotten to know the city. I got to know all of the pieces of that job. And then when there was a big story and somebody wanted to tell somebody, because as I say when I do speaking engagements with people, 3 people can keep a secret if 2 are dead. So we have, a police officer who is calling me, and on a landline. For all those in the audience here, there's no cell phone, there's no texting, there's no internet, there is nothing. So when your phone rings at late at night, the first thing you think of is like, who's dead in my family first, because you just didn't call people that late. You can text them now, but you didn't call people that late. And this was, I could tell by the officer's voice that this was not a joke, because initially someone tells you something like that, that's shocking information.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, are they trying to have some fun with me? But his voice was very dire. It was very, I want to say, not necessarily emotional, but I would say more incredulous that something like this had happened here. Because this kind of stuff, we always used to say that happens other places. That happens in California. That happens in Florida. No,
that
these
happened
kinds
in Chicago.
of things, these things happen everywhere. And the reason that serial killers go so long without getting caught is because they act in places where they're not going to be noticed. And that was exactly the case with Jeffrey Dahmer. The family of the Laotian boy, when he was killed in May of 1991, there were 5 murders after that. So between May and July, there were 5 more murders.
He ramped up a lot as he was getting closer to getting caught.
It tends to be what they do, Gwen. They tend to get sloppy, which is why he got caught. they tend to start to just get into a fervor to kill. And that's usually how they end up getting caught. And this was not, and the cops will tell you, this was not great police work to catch him. He was there. He was in the house. And when they came to knock on his door after his last victim, who would have been his last victim, escaped, when they showed up at the door, at first when Dahmer saw it was the police, he wasn't worried because he had manipulated the police lots of times before. He'd been able to talk his way out of anything because they're very clever and they're very manipulative. And so there he is standing in front of the door, and Dahmer opens the door for the police, and then he sees the man who would have been his 18th victim standing behind them, and then he tried to close the door. He started to fight a little bit, but eventually what happens when serial killers realize that they're caught and their spree is over is they feel a sense of relief. And that was probably Dahmer. The officers that made the arrest said, he just kind of went limp. It was like, okay, I guess you got me.
Yeah, I know, like, with his very first victim in Ohio, he ended up having contact with the police with the body in the back in garbage bags. So,
and it would be great if every cop had a magic 8-ball, right? Yeah. And they would know that this is a serial killer. But the thing about serial killers is they look like everybody else. If they all look like Manson, with the swastika carved in his head and the nutty eyes and the crazy hair and the whole thing, we would catch them. Yeah. But Dahmer didn't look like that. And when some poor, cop in Bath, Ohio stops Jeffrey Dahmer, an 18-year-old
kid. Like, and he's like, I'm taking the trash to the dump because you're not going to be, you're going to be like, okay, well, it's late, drive on the right side of the road, because that's why he got pulled over. He had crossed the middle line.
But you would be surprised how many people say, oh, that cop should have looked in those bags, or they should have thought something was suspicious. Sure, now we think that. But you have to remember that, first of all, the idea of serial killers wasn't really in our lexicon at that time either.
Yeah, that's a newer term. I can't remember when the FBI coined the phrase, like when it became like, but it was in like, I think mid-'80s when that was first starting to become a phrase. I'd read the book Mindhunter, and they were talking about when that became a thing, and the FBI were talking to people who had killed multiple and came up with the term serial killer. Okay. So to bring it back to that apartment that night, you're in there, the fridge is there. Do you regret not opening that fridge?
Well, I didn't get in the apartment. All right. So I was at the threshold of the door. It was very early in this investigation. The two cops that had made the discovery, one of them was standing outside in the hallway with his hands just covering his eyes, and holding his head. That officer, Rolf Mueller, never got over it. He never got over what he saw. He never, to the day after he retired and long into his retirement, his wife said he never got over it. He was traumatized till the day he died by this case. There was no way for me to go in there. I mean, there's crime scene tape in front of the door, but I was able to get up to the second floor, which is where his apartment was. And I stood at the door, and I'm just kind of looking around, and people said, oh my goodness, I can't believe the police didn't see, Annie Schwartz standing there. And I said, well, let's think about what they were seeing. Let's think about what they were finding inside that apartment. They were finding all manner of evidence of Dahmer's crimes, not just opening the refrigerator and finding a human head in the refrigerator, but also, finding boxes with the bones in them, and opening up a dresser drawer and finding Polaroids that Dahmer had taken of his victims in various stages of dismemberment. So trust me, they're not looking and saying, hey, look, the blonde reporter's here. No one noticed. No one noticed.
Yeah, they're busy trying to process what they're seeing and how big this is, because it was big. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer has become one of the most well-known true crime stories in history. Like, his name's up there with Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy,
Ed Gein.
Like, he's up there with the big dogs, so to speak. looking back, how did it feel in the beginning at that apartment, knowing what you know now about how big this case became?
Well, at the time, I didn't know how big the case would be because I'm Annie Schwartz, a reporter for the Milwaukee Journal in a city where nothing really big ever happens. So I didn't understand the enormity of it. The first day when I came back to the newsroom and I wrote my first day story, after I got a call from the New York Times and they were going to be running my story on the front page of their paper, I said, people are interested in this. People want to know about this, and the phone calls into the newsroom were incredible. And so there were. I mean, you could tell eventually that it was a big story. But when you're a journalist, you are doing the task at hand. It's kind of like, when they asked the Navy SEALs who arrested bin Laden and killed bin Laden, and they said, how did you feel knowing it was such a big deal? At the time, one of the reasons the SEALs and the teams are such incredible tacticians is because they focus on the task, they focus on what they're doing, and they think about the ramifications later, which is pretty much what I did.
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Let's focus on the task we got to do ahead of time, and then we'll see where it leads.
I was more excited that I had the whole front page of the newspaper, and
that had to have been really exciting. That the New York Times is calling this little Midwestern reporter,
right,
and wanting it on their paper.
Crazy. I mean, all the places that we ended up.
And this was like a big case around the world. It seemed like, even people like in Europe were like trying to contact, from at least what I read in the book, was that,
everywhere. Everywhere. What happened was people all over the world have been fascinated by serial murder. The Brits absolutely love to look into serial murder cases. They had Jack the Ripper.
They have their own good collection.
And they have their own good collection of serial killers. Germany, very, very popular in Germany. The book is published in a number of different languages. It's French, it's Polish, it's Spanish. There are people all over the world that are fascinated by this case. All over the world except for one place.
Milwaukee.
There it is.
But I think that's even true, from what I've heard with in Chicago, the people in Chicago don't really like to talk about John Wayne Gacy, and it seems like the people in the location of the serial killer don't like to talk about their serial killer. And I could kind of understand the mentality a little bit, because it's it's a little bit of a shame on your city to have one.
Well, sure. You say Plainfield, Wisconsin, and you only think of one name. You think of Ed Gein. It is very tough to want to be associated with these horrible, despicable crimes, especially because usually the city takes a beating. Our city took a big beating when the Dahmer case happened. A lot of people had, how did you not know? Oh, you didn't know because gay men were missing, and you're homophobic in Milwaukee, and you don't want to, the police didn't want to talk about it. The police are awful. Everybody comes at these stories with their outside view of what happened. And those of us who live here get frustrated because we're like, no, you don't understand. Let me tell you what Milwaukee was like in the late 80s, early 90s when these crimes were happening. Nobody knew they were happening.
I know you were the only reporter there. Was that the case for the whole night, or?
I was the first one on the scene because I got the call from one of the first officers on the scene. And I got there and I was by myself. I think that it was probably a little bit after, I think it might have been maybe after midnight when other media outlets started to show up. I know there was a TV station, Jeff Fleming, who's a reporter for Channel 4, the NBC station in Milwaukee. He got there pretty early. But I had already talked to the people that were standing outside the building. And I feel like those interviews were the most genuine interviews that those people gave, are the ones they did with me, because I showed up without a camera. I've got my notebook, and I just asked them, what happened? What are you hearing? And they talked. They talked about it, and they talked very honestly about it. As the case got more and more popular, all of a sudden, these people are getting calls from, Oprah Winfrey, and they want to go, they're going to get to go to Chicago in a limo and meet Oprah and be on the Oprah show and all those kinds of things. What happens is those viewpoints become tainted. Those accounts of what actually happened become tainted because people are so excited to be part of the story. Well, the simple thing that I said, that's not going to be enough to be interesting. I'll say more. I'll say other things happened.
Yeah, and then also you have the whole thing with the memories. And when we remember something, we're not actually like pulling like a file from a computer where we're creating a new file, and it's, so our memories aren't the same as, originally.
Well, the people that lived in that building, his neighbors are also victims because they're realizing that this traumatic, awful event happened right in their building, right where in their home, right where they lived.
Where they lived, raised their families, and then in 1992, then they have to move because it's decided that their home's going to be torn down. So they definitely are victims, too, because like you said, it's where they thought you think you're the safest at your home. And you don't ever think your neighbor's doing what he did.
It's also not the kind of place where everybody knows their neighbors. And that's important to mention to people as well, is that Jeffrey Dahmer's neighbors had no idea what was going on. None of them called the police ever to tell the police that something was wrong. One of them or two of them did complain to the superintendent of the building that there was a smell coming from his apartment. But Dahmer was smart enough to operate in a building in a challenged neighborhood in the city of Milwaukee where people keep to themselves. They don't want to know what you're doing over there.
Yeah, and I live, closer to downtown, so it's still, very much like on my block. I know what my neighbors look like, but I don't know their names. I've never really exchanged 2 words with my neighbors because it's kind of, since it isn't a higher crime area, it's, if you don't want any problems, like, you don't see nothing, you don't hear nothing, you mind your business. It's very much, if you don't want trouble, don't start none, there won't be none, and you mind your business.
And Jeffrey Dahmer, like all serial killers, pretty smart. They're cunning. They're smart in a cunning way. And he knew that he would be, listen, he was one of the only white people in that building. If he was, he might have been the only white guy in that building. I can't remember. But that was what the neighbors would say, that strange white guy. Think about all the other serial killers that get arrested and what they say. The Gilgo Beach serial killer out in New York. Long Island, for goodness sakes. The neighbors, what do the neighbors always say when they ask, did you know that guy? Well, yeah, he's a quiet guy, kept to himself, don't really know anything about him. And that's usually the answer. It's not, yeah, Joe, he was the life of the party. We know him. That's not the guy. It's also not the guy you think it is when you make those jokes with your friends.
The only one that I think was ever the life of the party, like, serial killer that people were like, yeah, he was like really big in the community. He was the life of the party, was John Wayne Gacy. But
well, he was literally the life of the party. I mean, he was a party clown.
But I think, he was the outlier. Most of the serial killers, they keep to themselves because they don't want you to know what they're doing. If you're looking at them, you could see through them.
They blend.
And they don't want you looking at them. I know people always bring up the childhood when people talk about serial killers because, I think it's more of people trying to figure out maybe if we can find them before they even kill somebody. That's my beliefs on why people look so hard into the childhoods of serial killers.
Well, that's a big part of the blame game, Gwen, is that when these things happen, it has to be somebody's fault. Somebody screwed up somewhere. Somebody missed something. We always got to look back and say, whose fault is it? And the easiest thing to do would be to blame Jeffrey Dahmer's parents, although I would argue they have some culpability in the way that, I shouldn't say in the way their son turned out, because serial killer, who knew? But at the very least, that their son was emotionally damaged by what he was witnessing at home.
Yeah, they did not help the situation. I know that they were abusive and combative towards each other.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't found any records or interviews that said that they directed that towards the children, but I know that they were throwing things at each other.
Mm-hmm.
I know his mom had a lot of, health, mental health issues with depression, and
she was taking medications for that, psychotropic drugs, while she was pregnant with Jeffrey.
According to Jeffrey Dahmer's dad, she would have moments of complete paralyzations while she was pregnant. From what I've heard, she said that didn't happen, but
his father may not be the most reliable storyteller, because he had a viewpoint. Obviously, he also, I can tell you, after having met and talked with Lionel Dahmer, he suffered tremendously. He spent his entire life after 1991 trying to figure out where he went wrong and how things went bad. And we talked about, let's talk about his childhood, about Jeffrey's childhood. And Lionel Dahmer, with a completely straight face, tells you the stories of how, Jeffrey was interested in, he'd bring roadkill home. He didn't kill the animals. Yeah. He didn't torture animals.
That's one thing he did that, that isn't, normal. Most serial killers, that's one of the precursors, is they hurt animals. Jeffrey Dahmer, there's no record of him ever hurting an animal.
No, he looked for the roadkill. He'd find it on the side of the road. In fact, he and his father would drive around, and Jeffrey would say, "Oh, there's a raccoon," and they'd pick it up and they'd bring it back to the house. And then his father told him how to use the chemicals to skin it. And then, Jeffrey was fascinated by the insides of these animals, by the entrails. So what is the difference between, and this is just this is rhetorical, but what's the difference between that kid who becomes a serial killer and the kid that becomes a taxidermist, or the kid that becomes a veterinarian, or that, I don't know. But it seems like a lot to expect Lionel Dahmer to have all these premonitions that this kid's going to do this. But it's also a really creepy thing for your kid to do.
Yeah, and
you're driving around helping him. Oh, there's one. That's not like the usual kid family outing.
I had read in another book, it was by a British author. I can't think of the name of the book at the moment, but it was looking into what made Jeffrey, at a psychological standpoint, what made Jeffrey Dahmer who he was. So it looked into his childhood and all of the stuff. And it was talking about how there was a conversation at the dinner table where Jeffrey Dahmer was asking his dad a question about how best to preserve bones, or it was, for most families it would be a very bizarre question, and his dad answered it because his dad was a chemist, and
his dad was a chemist. His mother was pretty detached from everything that was going on in the house.
Yeah, so it's so from his dad's chemist brain, it's looking back, he's yeah, that might have been a weird question to ask, but he was
you have to, when you look at these stories and when you report on these stories, you have to look at the people from where they are in the story. You can't look at it from where you are, because whenever I hear about a story where there's a 14-year-old kid that takes a gun and shoots and kills his mother, and everyone's going, 14, my gosh, my little Billy is 14, he could never. That's looking at the story from where you are. You're not looking at the story from where this child is and what this child is experiencing. So that's really the most important. I think trying to take that subjectivity out of it, even though there's truly nothing that's truly objective, but That was certainly one of the things that I remember most is that, again, the task at hand, report on what's happening in front of you.
And I can kind of, somewhat see from, Lionel Dahmer's point of view, him being a really big scientist and into chemistry, thinking that this might just be his son following in his footsteps, wanting to follow science.
Sure. And Lionel says that when you speak to him. But he also talks about being in denial that his kid was as weird as he was. I mean, without all the animal stuff, Jeffrey Dahmer is already a weird kid. He's strange. He's detached. He doesn't have any friends. He doesn't have anybody that comes over the house to play. He's just doesn't have, any kind of social interaction. So when he shows interest in anything, Dad's overjoyed, even if it is,
slightly concerning.
Concerning to us.
Yeah.
But to him, Dahmer's so passionate about it. Jeffrey's so passionate about it that the father thinks that that's a positive.
And then, the slightly few friends that he did somewhat make, he's running up and putting his head on their chest to listen to their hearts.
And again, that's according to them.
Yeah.
And you always got to look at those interviews and say those interviews were given after everybody knew who he was. So did Jeffrey Dahmer do that? I don't know. He never talked about that. And let me tell you, he talked about everything else. In his confession to police, he gave everything up.
It was 150 pages.
Mm-hmm. There was no reason to wonder what he might have thought about something. So if he remembered some kind of behavior, or he remembered something from his childhood, he would call these detectives in the middle of the night and say, get them over here. I remembered something else. Or I remembered something that'll help find another victim.
When you talk to the families of the victims, how did you handle your own emotions? Because they're in deep grief, finding out what has happened to their loved one. So how did you kind of keep your emotions out of it? And then decompress after, when you went home, after working on this case, because this is some really dark stuff, to, keep yourself sane.
I always approached stories as a story. I always approached cases and crimes and all of those situations as a story that I was there to tell. So to me, I was always looking, I was like, that's crazy. And I don't think I ever put my emotions in there because that's just not something I did. To this day, I don't in my day-to-day work. I pull the emotions and put them in a different place so that I can really analyze what's going on. And when it came to the Dahmer case, there were different kinds of grief. There were parents who dearly loved their sons. Their sons came out to them. They knew that they were gay, and they were okay with it. There were people that noticed the day after their loved one disappeared that they were gone. But then there were also the parents who hadn't seen their loved one, who had cut them off when they tried to come out to them. You're no longer part of this family. Get out of my sight. So you're estranged from your child or your brother or your sister, and now they end up being killed by this extremely famous, criminal. And not only did you not get to say goodbye, but you never got to have closure on that part of your life with them. There were families that didn't believe that their loved ones were gay. And that was another thing. So you find out your son is dead. Your son is killed by this, in this horrible way, as if there's a good way, but I mean in this awful way. And then you find out that your son also had a secret life that you were not aware of, that they were living as a gay man in 1980s Milwaukee. And you have to remember back to that time, it wasn't loud and proud at all. It was a very closeted community. That's why there were only just a few bars, and that's why everybody in the community kind of knew each other, because there were only a few bars over on South 2nd Street where they all went, because it wasn't okay to be out for many people. I'm not saying for everyone, but that contributes to the anger of the families because they're angry that they didn't know this part of their child. They're angry that they cut off contact with them, and they're angry that they're never going to be able to make it right.
I can't even imagine that kind of feeling. I feel for the families because
of course,
because they have to live with this. They're the only ones still living with this because the victims that he killed are gone. He's gone. He only had to suffer punishment for 2 years and 4 months, and then he was gone. And I like to believe that he is suffering for all eternity. But, that the family still have to live with this. And out of everybody involved with this case that, were fully victimized by it, they're the ones that are still dealing with the consequences of what one man chose to do. So I do feel very much for the family. I know that the police officers in May got blamed for, and looking on hindsight, and from this perspective, they could have stopped him in May, but they believed Dahmer because he was so cunning. You knew those police officers.
I still do.
So I wanted to know what your thoughts of that whole messy situation was, knowing the police officers, because the media villainized them.
Of course they did. Well, and it's very fashionable to villainize the police, even more so now than it was back then. But that was easy because what happened was we went back and looked for all the police contacts, all the calls for police service on that block. And we found that police had been at that address. And so going back and then finding Glenda Cleveland and finding, her niece and having those conversations. But from their perspective, it was the police didn't listen to us. I've worked for the Milwaukee Police Department. I was their spokesperson for 10 years. I learned a lot about the police, both as a reporter reporting on them and reporting for them. And what I know is that it's an impossible job. It's an impossibly difficult job. But I do know that these two officers showed up in a challenged neighborhood where every crazy thing happens all the time to a call from someone who said there's a young boy running up the alley and he's naked. All right? So these two officers show up, and it's not shocking. You hear that people wear foil on their heads and, prom dress and direct traffic. It's not, and this is where all the crazy stuff happens, was in Squad 30's area down in the 3rd District of the police department at that time.
I don't live very far from that area. Mm-hmm. It's still I don't like to. I live more in West Milwaukee, and I don't really like crossing the viaduct.
Yeah. Well, there are, so we ask the police to go to those neighborhoods that we don't want to go to, right? So these two officers pull up, and they see the boy sitting. If he is a boy, we'll talk about that in a second. But they see him sitting in the back of the ambulance with one of those, it looks like a big piece of aluminum foil, the blanket, around him. And he's not able to really communicate with them. So Dahmer, being Dahmer, doesn't look suspicious. He walks right up to the cops and says, "Oh, that's my boyfriend, Jim. He gets really, really drunk. I was going to get some more beer for me. And apparently when I walked out, he came running out of the house. He said, I'm really sorry about this. This is just how he is." Dahmer was so convincing. And why should it be surprising to people that he manipulated everybody else? He manipulated his parole officer into thinking that he was,
He was under parole. The courts were watching him at this time, and he was fooling his parole officer.
Sure.
Because
he was good at it. So he tells these officers, this is my boyfriend. They don't just take him at face value. They say, okay, well, let's maybe, and he's like, let me just take him back upstairs. And the cops don't just leave it there. They say, we'll come with you. So they go with Dahmer and with the victim. They get up there, and so the victim is not able to talk. It's not because he's drunk. It's because he's drugged pretty heavily. But Dahmer told the police he doesn't speak English very well. So they come in the apartment, and what do the officers see? Okay. Remember, they see all kinds of apartments, all kinds of living situations. It smells. You'd think that's the first apartment they've been in that smells? I mean, I've been in hundreds of apartments that were in our city that were, I would consider them to be uninhabitable because of the way that people live and the way that they smell and the things that people do. But Jeffrey Dahmer didn't shoot up any of those red flags. The officers walk in, they see the victim's clothes folded neatly at the corner of the couch. They also see Polaroids sitting on the table. Remember, we talked about the fact that Dahmer photographed his victims in various stages of dismemberment, but he also photographed them naked.
That's how he got him to the house.
That's how he got him to the house.
$50 if you take naked picture frame.
And so that's what they saw. So by all those things, and now the victim is drugged, right? So he's not able to communicate. So when he sits down on the couch, he's not fighting to leave. He's not screaming, "Help me." He's not making emotions like, "Don't leave me here," right? Yeah. So the officers say, okay, it's what else would we have them do? Do we wish that, and one of the officers told me, he said, do I wish that I would have said, hey, maybe we should look in the bedroom and see if there's a decomposing body laying on the bed, which there was. But that's not realistic. And there are other crimes these guys have to get to. By all appearances, this is indeed a fight between a couple having consensual relations with each other. And let me tell you that the victim in that particular murder did not look like a 14-year-old. We were never able to prove how old he actually was because there were no birth certificates for these kids. They came here as refugees. There was no way to figure out who they actually were or how old they actually were. But there was a photograph, one of the photographs of this victim from that night where he looks like a fully grown adult. And there were even the officers had even wanted they wanted the police chief at the time to take a look at the photograph to say, This is who we're looking at. He didn't look like the photo that's being shared by the family. That's like his 6th grade picture. This is what he looked like, and the chief wouldn't hear it. There was just too much public pressure coming down on him to get rid of these officers.
And the people already hated that chief. From what I had read and heard about that time, was that people didn't. He wasn't a popular man already, mm-hmm. and with all the other pressures.
He was the first chief that came from outside the police department. He was also, he had the shortest amount of tenure, I think, of just about any police chief until, recent years. But he's the one that came here and started what was called the COPS program, the community-oriented policing. And community-oriented policing was something that the community just didn't understand. They understood, lock them up, throw away the key. That's what people understood. So he was an innovator in many ways, and that's not always really popular.
And I know, the night, where he was caught, the reason the police saw the Polaroids of the dismembered body was because he followed Jeffrey Dahmer into the bedroom to get the key for the handcuffs around the mm-hmm. last person. Mm-hmm. And that's when he saw the Polaroids, mm-hmm. because those Polaroids were kept in the bedroom. Mm-hmm. And, they didn't have permission to search his whole apartment and look around his whole apartment.
Let's talk about it from a legal standpoint. There was no probable cause for those officers to search that apartment any further.
Yeah, they could only see where Jeffrey let them look.
and Jeffrey Dahmer kept all the tools of his crime in the bedroom, in the closet, away from out of sight. Yeah. So you can only search or look anything that's in plain sight that might give you concern, but there wasn't anything in plain sight
that gave them concern. His living room looked like a normal
It looked like a single guy's living room. I saw it. I stuck my head in. I looked around the corner. It looked like a regular. I mean, the furniture was kind of tossed around because he had fought with the officers on the floor. But
from what I heard, it was a very tidy place, at least in like the living room.
no, he was. It looked like a single guy's apartment.
What was it like to be in this, like, in the same room with Jeffrey Dahmer? Because you were at his trials, like both, like, when he first appeared in September, and then you were in like the courtroom for some of the case, like trial in January, because sometimes you were in the media center, it seemed like, and other times
I was in the courtroom every single day, and then we would do our work or prep our stories down in the media center where all of the media were gathered. And Court TV, which was a fledgling operation at the time, was giving a live feed of the courtroom into the media room, so they felt like you didn't have to be there. I wanted to be in the courtroom because I sat in the row right in front of the families. So that I just wanted to be right there. I wanted to experience it. I wanted to hear if there were gasps. I wanted to hear if there was anything from the families. The scariest thing about Jeffrey Dahmer, I always say, is he looked like everybody else. We were waiting for this guy to come into court at his initial appearance, right? We'd read all the stories. It's like, oh my God. He finally comes out the door, and we're like, oh, that's weird. He could even be considered, a good-looking guy. So we were all kind of shocked that he didn't look like Charles Manson. Because when they look like Manson, it's so much easier to hate them and think they're, nuts and believe all this. When they don't look like that, when they look like your brother, it's tougher.
I always kind of wonder if his brother got his name changed, knowing
he did. His brother was given the same name change opportunity that they give people in witness protection. So his name was changed forever and ever.
I know he doesn't want to be associated with it. But
he does not. But he still lives in Ohio. He's married. He has kids. And he just does not want to talk about this case now. There's nothing to say that on his deathbed he's not going to want to say something. But they were pretty far apart in age as well.
Yeah, Jeffrey named him, which is why I would think he would want his name changed, because his parents let him, little Jeffrey, name his brother.
I think that this guy doesn't want his name out there for any reason. Yeah. He just, you say Dahmer, and everybody knows what that means.
Yeah.
You don't want to have that last name.
Yeah, you don't want the last name, and then even like with the first name, like knowing what your brother did, if my brother named me and that did what, I'd be like, yeah, I'm changing the whole thing. What was the atmosphere like in the courtroom? Because I've never been to a trial, like a real trial, sat in the courtroom, especially for a murder case. So, I know that emotions are high in the courtrooms. What was your impression of that atmosphere?
Well, that trial lasted 3 weeks, and they held court from Monday through Saturday, and there were always I was always curious about the number of people who came, like with their kid, or came just to sit in the courtroom and listen and see him and hear, and there were plenty of people that did that. So that was always kind of strange. And then, then we would interview them. So what happens when you can't interview the person you wanted to, and the families don't really want to, they don't have anything more to say, you start to interview each other. And there were people that just said, well, we knew it was historic, so we wanted to come in and see him in person. I always found that odd. I thought that was strange. But if you would have asked me if people would watch trials on television all day long on a channel devoted to only that, I would have said, that's a terrible idea. So clearly, I would not have founded Court TV.
Like, I know you said that, Jeffrey Dahmer was, very, I've heard you say, with other interviews, that was very vanilla.
Oh, yeah. He's very vanilla. There was nothing remarkable about him. There was nothing interesting about him. There was no inflection in his voice. He did not laugh. He didn't cry. He was absolutely just what you see is what you get. And he stuck to just one-word answers or two-word answers. You don't have a conversation with him. You ask him questions and he gives you a one or two-word answer.
Yeah, like, and all like the pictures like I've seen of him and like of like pictures from like from the court trial, he's very stone-faced.
Yeah, I mean, it was just like there was nothing going on behind his eyes. I mean, when the sister of one of the victims tried to attack him when she got up to give her victim impact statement, he didn't even flinch. I mean, she wanted to get him. And she came out from behind the podium where she was speaking. She came over to tried to come over and attack him at the defense table, and he never moved. He didn't even flinch.
Yeah, I remember reading that, and I'm like, that was kind of like, because your instinct is to flinch, at least, and that he didn't. Is like,
I think there was a part of him that believed that whatever happened to him now was just fine. If this is how he's going to die, then that's it.
Yeah. I know, like, at the end of your book, like, in your kind of where are they now?
Oh, the afterword. Mm-hmm.
You said that, like, Jeffrey Dahmer had actually called you and was mad. Like, how did you feel having a serial killer mad at you?
Like your life isn't weird enough, right? It was very strange and it was very brief. But this just shows how manipulative he was because he knew that I was going to be doing the book tour. It was 1992, the trial's over, and he knew that I was going to be out there promoting the book. And the thing that upset him most about the book, the thing that upset him most about the media coverage, really, was that he felt that his parents were being blamed. And he was so protective about his mother and his father, it's not even funny. He just was so... The only thing he said was, nobody's to blame for what I did but me. And so, would you like to expand on that? I mean, that was it. And so that was just a crazy moment.
And truth be told, he's not wrong. He's the one that did it. Like,
But what I find interesting is he wasn't afraid, or he was compelled to do the most awful things we can imagine to other people. Yet he was very concerned about anyone saying anything untoward about his mother or father. And that's interesting to me.
Yeah, that's extremely interesting that, like, maybe that was the only shred of humanity he had.
I don't know. It's hard to think that there was any humanity there at all, because the way that he talked about these crimes when he talked to the detectives, the two detectives that I wanted to say befriend him, but they weren't friends. But these detectives knew how to interrogate a prisoner, so they knew how to get people to...
They were good at their jobs.
Absolutely. And so Dahmer trusted them. He'd call them. But he never spoke. There was no intonation. There was no, oh, my God, can you believe this? It was just... And then I thought that was really strange, so I thought I couldn't believe that. And then, it just monotone.
Yeah, how I was explaining, the case to, my husband was, that he spoke very monotone, kind of like a robot.
Mm-hmm. Not a lot of inflection, not a lot of, not a lot of fancy vocabulary. The least amount he could say possible. Except when he was kind of going back and remembering all the crimes. Then he told those things like stories, but still no inflection and just completely expressionless.
Yeah, almost like, he was telling a story of how he went to the grocery store and picked out some bread and not doing what he did. It has been over 30 years since Jeffrey Dahmer was killed in prison. Why do you feel his story remains so relevant today and leaves a haunting presence over Milwaukee, even to the people who weren't alive?
Yeah, that's finding out if a friend of mine will introduce me to someone and say she broke the Jeffrey Dahmer story, there are younger people that do not know who that is. And that freaks me out a little bit because you'd be hard pressed to find anybody who was around during that time who wouldn't know. But I think that the genre of true crime has become so fascinating. That's why we reissued the book on the 30-year, I don't know if we want to call it the anniversary or the commemoration of the discovery. We wanted to put the story out to this new audience. And then that just kind of compelled a final chapter to say, where are they now and what happened to everybody? So the case remains the most awful thing you can associate with Milwaukee. But no matter who I run into, even if they start by saying, "Oh my God, that's disgusting," tell me more. There's always that little bit. There's a reason that true crime is the number one platform, the number one genre in television, movies, online, podcasting. The true crime stories are what people listen to. And there are any number of theories for why that is. Is it because it's like, thank God that wasn't me, so I can listen to someone else's story and feel better about my life? Do people watch it or do they consume true crime because they want to make sure they don't make the kinds of mistakes the victims did? Do they want to understand? We always want to understand why. What's the first thing you say when you're a kid?
Why?
The first word you say is why, and then you say it a million times. And people want to know why. And I don't know that you ever really get that answer.
Why is the hardest question to answer? I know, me personally, I'm into true crime because I'm really into psychology and why people behave the way they behave. So it's like,
and some people are, but go deeper than that. Why? Like the kid, why?
Yeah.
Why are you into that? Why is that? Why is that something you want to know all about? Well, it's something that's either entertaining or fascinating, or it's people are drawn to these stories.
Yeah. I always want to know what brings somebody who looks like a human to these unimaginably dark deeds that are monstrous. They're not they're monsters in human skin. That's how I always look at these serial killers, is they look like they're human, but to do that, you're not human. You're a monster in a human suit.
Hence the title of the book.
What do you feel is the most important thing people should know about the case of Jeffrey Dahmer?
That it happened, that it can happen, that the police were not responsible for what happened to one of the victims and then the subsequent victims after that. I'm not an apologist for the police, but it's very important to me as someone who by and large supports the police to say that the way that the city was portrayed, the way that it was portrayed that the police were some kind of homophobic, careless group of people is not accurate. And I feel very strongly about being out there and saying that, because that you're operating on an unrealistic set of expectations if you think there was anything about this guy that was a red flag.
And that's one reason why I wanted to ask you about it, because you know and knew the police officers involved. When this case was happening, I was one. I was a 1-year-old. I didn't know these people. If I ran into them at the grocery store living here in Milwaukee, I wouldn't know them. I never had a relationship with them. I don't know them. So I was reading your book, knowing you knew the families. I was it's very easy for me to just pick up what the media tells me they were.
Oh, please don't do that.
And I'm but I do know the media lies. Sometimes they try to tell you the truth, but other times there's agendas involved. And so I'm I wanted to know from somebody who knew these people, who there isn't an agenda involved, that you knew them, you had drinks with them, you went to picnics with them, according, so I'm what were these police officers really like that did get demonized? And
well, I appreciate you having me on your podcast to talk about it. and to say all those things out loud because not a lot of people do. So I appreciate you taking the time for me today.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it was great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for coming and talking with us. Now, this case has haunted Milwaukee's consciousness since it broke over 30 years ago. But there are some alleged ghost sightings that coincide with the Jeffrey Dahmer case. At the Ambassador Hotel, where the first murder in Milwaukee took place, guests report seeing a man covered in blood who looks like Dahmer. This man is seen walking through the rooms and disappearing through walls. And then there's the Oxford Apartments, which in 1992 was demolished and remains vacant to this day at the request of the families of the victims. Locals believe that this land that the Oxford Apartments once stood is cursed land. People report a heavy, oppressive feeling in the area, and some claim to hear moans and cries when no one else is around. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Gwen the Ghost Guide, where we discuss Jeffrey Dahmer. Our next episode is going to be a surprise. So until then, we'll haunt you later.